So let's talk about Jane Austen. Now, I like Jane Austen. I like Jane Austen a lot. Like, a lot. Here are some Jane Austen books I own. Here are some more Jane Austen books I own. Here are several screen adaptations of Jane Austen books that I own on DVD. Here's my Jane Austen t-shirt. Here's my Jane Austen bag. Here's the little Jane Austen illustration that hangs on my wall. Here are my Jane Austen mugs. And here's me dressed up as Kitty Bennet at the Jane Austen Centre where I worked until a few weeks ago. You could say I'm obsessed. You might be right. So, as I made pretty clear in my Let's Talk About Dickens video, my favourite author of all time is Charles Dickens. However, Jane Austen is my second. I love her. She is brilliant. She is wonderful. Her books are amazing. Jane Austen was born in December 1775 and died in July 1817. She had 4 novels published during her lifetime, 2 were published shortly after her death, and then her juvenilia and shorter work were published later on in the 19th century. Now, Jane Austen doesn't get as much bad press as Dickens. In general, she is more universally liked. She is considered less of an acquired taste than Dickens is, much as I love him. But there are still some myths surrounding Jane Austen and her books that really do irritate me. One of them is that her books are women's literature, which really irritates me. At the Jane Austen Centre, all the time, I would get men, usually middle-aged men who'd been dragged around their wives, come up to me, and when I asked if they'd like Jane Austen, they'd say, "No, I don't really like that kind of women's fiction." And I'd sit there and grit my teeth in anger and make polite conversation because 1, what is women's fiction anyway? Is that a thing anyway? 2, Jane Austen is not just for women. Jane Austen is not just soppy romance. Jane Austen is so much more than that. Firstly, Jane Austen isn't soppy. I mean, not very. She's probably less soppy than Charles Dickens. And yes, there is romance in Jane Austen's books, but there's also complex and interesting social criticism. And her love stories are not cliched. They only feel like cliches because they have been reused and reused so many times since she wrote them that they have become cliches. She invented the cliches. For example, take a look at like standard rom-com plots. The 2 best friends who fall in love without realising it, or the boy and girl who meet each other and hate each other until they come to love each other. Yeah, Jane Austen created them, and they're still in popular culture. Isn't that cool? Because Jane Austen, she was awesome. So yeah, I just wanted to make a video about the reasons why I love Jane Austen quite as much as I do. Reason number 1 why Jane Austen is amazing. Heroes and heroines. Jane Austen writes brilliant heroes and heroines. There is a reason why Mr. Darcy has become like an iconic symbol of perfect masculinity, of the perfect man, and it's not just because Colin Firth apparently looks good coming out of a lake. Jane Austen writes very good, very complex, very interesting romantic leads for her books. If you think about Mr. Darcy, he is considered like a symbol of perfection in a way, but he's not really perfect. For a lot of the book, he's not that nice. He is a complete snob. He's really socially awkward, really proud, but he changes, he progresses, and he's a very interesting, complex character. And one of the things I think that make him such a popular character is that he's not just like 2D hero, he's not just like perfection, he is more than that. And all of Jane Austen's heroes and heroines are like that. In Sense and Sensibility, both Eleanor and Mary Ann are flawed. Eleanor is too sensible at times, too repressed to really cope with everything she's going through in her heart and her mind. And Mary Ann is so emotional and so open that it brings her into a lot of trouble. And they both learn from each other in a really lovely way. Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. She is so repressed, she is so quiet. I have heard a lot of people refer to her as dull and boring. But what makes her a really interesting character to read about is that she has very strong moral principles and a really strong sense of what she believes is right and wrong for her and for other people. And although she's very quiet, she has so much going on inside her. And the reason why she is a very interesting character to read about is not because she's perfect or because she's wonderful, but because she is complex and interesting and different and awkward and just, yeah, Jane Austen is great. Number 2, characters of a slightly nastier variety. Now, while I really love Jane Austen's heroes and heroines, while I love Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Knightley and Fanny Price, they are brilliant, my favourite characters in Jane Austen are always the nastier ones. Ones like Lady Susan from Lady Susan, like Isabella Thorpe from Northanger Abbey, like Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice, who is hilarious, and like Mrs. Elton from Emma, who just says the best, most atrocious, wonderful things. Jane Austen writes nasty people so utterly brilliant. brilliantly. And you can tell, I think, how much she enjoys writing these characters. Like, if you look at the massive speeches Mrs. Norris has in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen clearly just loved writing this horrible woman. But she captures her so well and so complexly, because Mrs. Norris isn't just nasty because she's nasty because she's a little afraid and she's a little bit self-conscious about her class position within the family at Mansfield Park, because she is less wealthy than the Bertrams and Fanny is less wealthy than all of them. Mrs. Norris puts Fanny down as much as possible because she doesn't want to be seen as the low one in the family. She doesn't want to be seen as the poor relation. She's not very nice, but she has her reasons, and all of Jane Austen's characters, I think, are complex like that. Number 3, wit. Jane Austen is so darn funny. Like, I know I've said this before, but few things make me laugh as much as Charles Dickens and Jane Austen. I clearly have a very 19th century sense of humour. But anyway, Jane Austen's books are so witty. But if you think about like Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, he is a hilarious, brilliant character. I developed this little test while working at the Jane Austen Centre. At the Jane Austen Centre, everyone that comes around the exhibition gets a 10-minute introductory talk. And in my introductory talk, I mentioned Mr. Collins. And I would watch my audience while talking about Mr. Collins and see who smiled. Because genuinely, people that really love Jane Austen, if you mention the name Mr. Collins to them, they will slightly giggle to themselves. It sums up the wit and the comedy of Jane Austen's characters that the mere mention of Mr. Collins' name can make people laugh. That's great. Reason number 4, social criticism. As I said before, Jane Austen's books are by no means merely love stories. They are about so much else. And often what they're about is money. If you look at most of Jane Austen's novels, the things that are at their centre are ideas about family and about marriage. And marriage in the early 19th century tends to come down to 2 things. Love, yes, but also money. Jane Austen very interestingly and very purposefully explores a lot of issues that were facing women at that time, especially women of Jane Austen's class. The reason why marriage is at the heart of her book is because for so many women of Jane Austen's class, the aim to get married was at the heart of your life. If you were a woman of a high class, then effectively the only respectable options for you were either to get married or to become a school teacher or a governess, which was respectable but not as respectable as getting married, or to live off your family or your life, which could be hard, especially if, as in the case of the Bennet girls, you have lots of sisters and no brothers. The reason why all Jane Austen's heroines are so keen to get married, and the reason why their mothers are also desperate to make them get married immediately, is because without that, they will be basically destitute. Without that, they have no other way of economically supporting themselves. So really, you have to feel very sorry for Mrs. Bennet, and you have to understand why she is so obsessed with getting her daughters married, because if they don't get married, like, she doesn't know what will become of them after the death of her and her husband. And I love the way Jane Austen deals with these really important social issues from the early 19th century. She also talks a lot about social class, about conflicts over where your class position is. For example, if you think about the difference between the Darcys and the Bennets and what it means to be a gentleman or a lady, Jane Austen's books are in many ways as political as they are romantic. It may be said that she's just writing about marriage and that's why all the kind of political, social issues around that come into play, but actually I don't think that's the case. For example, we know that Jane Austen chose to write anonymously but under the pseudonym A Lady, rather than pick a gender-neutral pseudonym or a male pseudonym as many female authors did later on in the 19th century. She wanted everyone to know that she was a woman, and I think that's really telling about the kind of issues she was dealing with and the kind of things she wanted to say to society as a whole. She wanted to deal with the issues that faced women at the time and what that meant. I think that is the only way in which you can consider Jane Austen's works women's literature, in the way that they tend to be about the issues facing women at the time, but that doesn't mean they're just for women, not by any stretch of the imagination, so all the men that said that at the Jane Austen Centre, no, you are wrong. Anyway, number 5, love stories, because let's be honest, she does do them really, really well. One of the reasons I really love Jane Austen's love stories and the romantic plotlines in her books is that she sets up the relationship between the 2 characters so well. Think about Pride and Prejudice, the dialogue between Lizzie and Darcy, especially, for example, when they dance at the Netherfield Ball. Like, their dialogue all the way through the book is just brilliant. It's effectively Regency flirting, even if Lizzie doesn't always realise it is. It's just brilliant and so well written and so clever, their whole relationship the whole way through the book. And that's the same with many other relationships in many of her books. Jane Austen writes absolutely brilliant, beautiful love stories that are really moving but also often feel quite real. Like, a lot of the time people say that Jane Austen's love stories feel cliché or a bit overdone or a bit soppy, but actually I would argue that that's not the case. A lot of the time her love stories aren't actually that romantic. Like, if you think about Edmund and Fanny in Mansfield Park, like, we never actually get to see the proposal scene at the end. That scene is never shown, which for me is a very interesting choice on the behalf of Jane Austen, because it shows that what she's trying to do there, to me, is show that it isn't like an idealised romantic thing going on between Edmund and Fanny. It's something much more deeper and much more complex than that. They are really, really fond of each other, and that's really important. There's a reason why, if you break down most modern rom-coms to their like basic plotline, you can match them up quite nicely with the Jane Austen romantic plotline. It's because her love stories were so impressive and so like timeless in a way that we are still using them today in so many films and stuff, and that's really cool. That says a lot about how wonderful a writer Jane Austen was and how great her plots are. And finally, the last thing I love so much about Jane Austen is the way her books affect people. I touched on this a bit in my video Jane Austen Cake, which I made when I left the Jane Austen Centre. One of the things I noticed working at the Jane Austen Centre is just how many people love Jane Austen and just how much they love her. And the fact that she still inspires such enthusiasm and such love in so many people so many years after her books were published, it's just brilliant. It's lovely. It shows so much about how powerful her characters are and how powerful her books are and how good a writer she was. It makes me happy that people come round the Jane Austen Centre with Colin Firth's face on a stick with a cravat. It makes me happy that people smile whenever you say the name of Mr. Collins. It makes me so happy that so many people enjoy her books, and it just reminds me every time I see other people enjoying Jane Austen, it reminds me how much I love her and why. So in conclusion, Jane Austen is wonderful. If you haven't read any Jane Austen, you should, and if you've read some Jane Austen, you should read more, and if you've read all of Jane Austen, you should go and reread her, because her books are just so great and wonderful, and I love them. Please let me know in the comments if you like Jane Austen and what you think of her, and I'll be back soon with another video. In the meantime, happy reading.